bit of impressive information about resistance and Black life in the Caribbean. I'm going to bring it stateside and talk about what I feel is another form of resistance related to African American life and history. And specifically, I'm going to focus in on Booker T. Washington. You heard earlier that much of my research has to do with beauty and the politics of identity. And I definitely view Booker T. Washington as an individual who not only understood the importance of projecting an image, but he also mastered it. And so the title of my presentation is Master of the Mask. God of our weary years, God of our silent tears, Thou who hast brought us thus far on the way, Thou who hast by Thy might led us into the light, keep us forever in the path, we pray. Lest our feet stray from the places, our God, where we met Thee, lest our hearts, drunk with the wine of the world, we forget Thee. Shadowed beneath Thy hand, may we forever stand true to our God, true to our native land. The words to Lift Every Voice and Sing, sometimes referred to as the Negro National Anthem, were first penned as a poem by James Weldon Johnson. Most people, particularly who study Black history, know that. At the time, he was an elementary school principal in Jacksonville, Florida. Principal Johnson chose to honor Booker T. Washington on the occasion of the great orator's visit to Jacksonville to speak at former President Lincoln's birthday celebration by writing the poem. He first recited it on February 12, 1900, upon rising to introduce Booker T. Washington. So the reason that I provide that context is to sort of communicate the importance that Booker T. Washington had in the eyes of not only Black America, but the wider populace as well. That this song that we revere to be sort of a signature inscription of the Black experience was presented to Washington at this celebration of emancipation, which at the turn of the century, unfortunately today, many Black Americans have sort of forgotten the significance of emancipation. You all have heard of Watch Night celebrations in the Black church, right? So many of the sermons we hear now sort of divorce themselves from the original concept of Watch Night services, which was rooted in the possibility of emancipation and freedom. So by the time you get to the 1900s, Black people are still very much so tied to this annual celebration of emancipation. Excuse me. Turn that off. Please forgive me. I'll go ahead and let you all know I have a five-month-old baby, and so everybody thinks everything is an emergency. How do you warm the milk? How do you wipe her butt? So my husband, he's good. He'll do the diapers and so forth. But if it's number two, it's my job. And so everything is an emergency, and everybody has to call me. But anyway, back to Booker T. Washington. And this song used to celebrate his arrival at this school in Jacksonville where James Weldon Johnson serves as principal. So in other words, the lyrics we call Our Anthem was a dedication from one of the NAACP's top figures, James Weldon Johnson, and one of the New Negro Renaissance's most renowned artists, to an ex-slave, Booker T. Washington, who carved his legacy in Macon County, Alabama. There is something to be said for that. What was it about this former slave from Virginia who didn't even know his biological father that made the world bend to him? And not just James Weldon Johnson, Black folks during his lifetime and in decades thereafter would name countless organizations and schools in Booker T. Washington's honor. Marcus Garvey, the great Pan-Africanist visionary, would write directly to Booker T. Washington and say, I want to build a little Tuskegee in Jamaica. And so you spoke about the Black experience in the Caribbean, and certainly Booker T. Washington has that reach with someone who is seen as a more, it's very interesting, I love your input on this. Marcus Garvey is seen as a more radical figure, right? While Booker T. Washington is often mischaracterized as an apologist and someone who cowed to white superiority. But in fact, it is Booker T. Washington who influences Garvey's and others who focus on the economic plight of Black Americans. In a 1940 interview with Fisk University's president, the great U.S. presidential advisor, Mary McLeod Bethune, talked about how she had a dream where Booker T. Washington would come and pass her this diamond, and this diamond would be representative of passing the torch in higher education to her. And we all know the story of Mary McLeod Bethune. She does move forward and lays the foundation for what ultimately would become Bethune-Cookman University, which still educates African Americans and others in Daytona Beach today. And so those are just some sort of examples of the way in which Booker T. Washington was influential during his lifetime. Carter G. Woodson, the great publisher, educator, institution builder, and father of Black history, referenced countless times Booker T. Washington as the standard bearer for how Black people should move forward in terms of focusing on their economic plight and how they would pull themselves up rather than being dependent on others. In Woodson's Miseducation, he wrote, "It is often said, too, that the time is not ripe for Negroes to take over the administration of their institutions, for they do not have the contacts for raising money. But what becomes of this argument when we remember what Booker T. Washington did for Tuskegee and observe what Robert Moton and John Hope are doing today?" And so he constantly references Booker T. Washington as the benchmark. He goes on to say, "Sad indeed, for the Negro Church is the only institution for the race controls. With the exception of feeble efforts of a few all but starved out institutions, the education of Negroes is controlled by the other element. And save the dramatization of practical education by Booker T. Washington, Negroes have not influenced this system at all in America." And so again, back to Booker T. Washington. And there are several instances where Woodson, again, someone that who is revered as it relates to institution building, again, bends to Booker T. Washington as the standard. The highest office in the land, the office of the president. People often recall Booker T. Washington at the White House, but it's important to remember in 1905, Theodore Roosevelt visits Tuskegee. In 1905, the president of the United States, a white man, and this is 10 years before the release of the movie Birth of a Nation that is depicting Africans as these bestial creatures who are after the virginity of white women, visits Tuskegee. And so we have to understand Booker T. Washington within that context. And this wasn't for show and tell. Booker T. Washington understood the significance of this kind of activity. This was Booker T. Washington calculating, projecting, planning, and shaping not only his image, but the image of Tuskegee University and its future. Roosevelt, what Dr. Washington said at Atlanta, what Professor Du Bois calls the Atlanta Compromise, is no compromise. This is what Roosevelt is saying. It is a principle of universal application, just as true and just as applicable in the northern factory as the southern plantation. In all things purely social, we can be as separate as the fingers, you all have heard this, and yet as one hand in all things essential to mutual progress. Never forget this principle. Never demand social recognition. Social recognition never given on demand. Let's be clear. Theodore Roosevelt is an imperialist and a racist. And if we read the whole article, we can see the paternalism in his words. But we must sift because there's some value in his words about Washington's philosophy. And it begs the question, what does popularity do? And I'd like us to think about everything that we're discussing here as it relates to the world of technology that we live in now. How can you cash in on popularity? And Booker T. Washington understood that social uplift, which is really all popularity is, right? We're on the cover of Vogue. We have a couple of shows on Netflix, right? But how is that valuable to the overall uplift of a group of people? Can you take that to Wells Fargo? And Booker T. Washington, I would argue, would say no. Oprah, Barack Obama, Black Panther, the movie, social popularity or recognition does nothing for the masses of Black people, which was Washington's main concern, the masses. We are all familiar with the schism that later dissolved between Du Bois and Washington. But there was a schism, and of course, Du Bois initially, early on in his career, put forth the idea of the talented 10. Booker T. Washington was always concerned about all Black people as opposed to this fictitious 10% that supposedly could lead us all to victory. In 1942, almost 30 years after Booker T. Washington's death, the U.S. Liberty ship was christened in his name. And again, presiding over that commission was Mayor McLeod Bethune. So again, lay people, all the way up to the highest office of the land, people are bending to Booker T. Washington and his power. Most telling, I would argue, about Booker T. Washington's influence was students. And so if any of you all have read Booker T. Washington's Up From Slavery, it talks about how students would come over and place an umbrella over his head while it was raining just to hear, his lectures and what he had to offer in terms of education and information to what ultimately would become the students of Tuskegee. They engaged his program, they implemented his teachings. Tuskegee's program provided students with both academic and vocational training. The students under Washington's direction built their own buildings, produced their own food, and provided for most of their own basic necessities. According to Washington, the students do not seem to want to see me carry a large book or satchel or any kind of burden through the grounds. Now, this is something I tell my students all the time. Primary sources are the gold standard in studying history. However, primary sources are also biased and can also lean one way or another. Up From Slavery is a primary source because it's written by Booker T. Washington. However, Booker T. Washington is a master of artistry and image making. And so as he says, the students don't want to see me carry a large book or satchel. We don't know to what extent that may be exaggerated, right? But the point that he is making is that he is revered by the student population. In such cases, he goes on, more than one always offers to relieve me. I almost never go out of my office when the rain is falling, that some student does not come to my side with an umbrella and ask to be allowed to hold it over me. So these are some of his own remarks about the kind of esteem that he carried amongst people right here. This is what we would call today simple marketing. When you go to the University of Alabama's website and it appears diverse, but there are actually few persons of color in the engineering or science or math program. In reality, the blackest thing that the University of Alabama has is its football team, right? But the website would indicate something altogether different. This is marketing. And this is not just with the University of Alabama. We can see that anywhere. Washington understands the importance of public relations and communications. Today we have whole offices that deal with this kind of image making. Nonetheless, Black support of Washington at every tier speaks for itself. So for two reasons, I want to emphasize Black History Month this month, and lifting Washington's name as appropriate for this space, and my own very deep and personal connection to it. So many of my family members come from Tuskegee, so that's part of the reason why I'm interested in Booker T. Washington and his life in the world of branding. He was your first mass media celebrity. Postcards, he understood the use of those and engaged in it. Magazines understood the use of those, engaged in it. Pamphlets, newspapers, matchboxes. You would eventually see his image on coins. There was a mix of low culture with black success, and what I mean by that is you could find him on a horse, but you could also see his image in a suit. He would purposely style himself to pose with a book open, with a pen at his desk. And so it's by no surprise that the United States president, all the way up to students who come from Macon County and obviously probably lacking in financial resources, all kinds of people would be interested in him, and he understood how image making would allow him to reach across the aisle, so to speak. He countered racist media of the time by producing images of himself highly stylized in that way. He produced an image within an image oftentimes, and what I mean by that is taking a look at what you would see him holding, or what might be in the background, or the area that he would stage himself in. These kinds of activities legitimized him as a national leader and helped him to advance his own ideologies. In fact, while presiding over Tuskegee, he had Francis Johnson produce a publication called Working with the Hands in 1902. This publication contained over 600 images, perfectly balanced, formal, students at work. You could see Miss Washington engaging in domestic training. Although she was a traveling club woman, she was also Tuskegee's top fundraiser. And so Booker T. Washington was no fool. He understood the importance of this publication, which is why he commissioned it. He wanted to show the kind of work that was being done at Tuskegee, and he wanted to feature some of its top leadership, including Ms. Washington. Booker T. Washington embraced photography as an artistic medium to represent himself and the university because it was economical, technical, utilitarian, and aesthetic. An apt form for a man who preached a gospel of thrift, industry, self-sufficiency, and beauty. Advancements in photography at the end of the 19th century allowed Washington to be simultaneously better known and more elusive. So what do we do with Instagram today? We are more popular and more mysterious at the same time, right? My husband and I just took a trip to the Dominican a minute ago, but I posted the pictures yesterday for Valentine's Day, right? And so I had a couple of people asking me, where's the baby when you guys left? Happy, is this what you all did for Valentine's Day? So on one hand, you're engaging an audience, creating some interest, but on the other hand, I'm elusive. You don't know where I was on what particular day. Actually, I was looking a hot mess yesterday for Valentine's Day, but this post suggested that I was on an island. And Booker T. Washington understood that 100 years prior to me posting for Instagram. Initially, he crafted an image of Victorian grace as a fundraising strategy, which appealed to elite white America's belief in gradual reform. As Washington entered the last decade of his life, he gradually shifted his efforts towards speaking directly to black audiences with the support of black photographers. He shed the passive role he presented to the white world and challenged racist popular culture by visually demonstrating social and cultural equality. Washington should be credited with not only launching the careers of several black photographers, but also with establishing the early aesthetic of the New Negro. And so while we associate the New Negro and the New Negro Renaissance with Harlem and Washington, D.C., I would argue that Booker T. Washington is very much so a part of that. Furthermore, he publishes a book called The New Negro that includes contributions from persons like W.E.B. Du Bois. So it's interesting how we compartmentalize them and we see them as two different entities rather than understanding them within the same social spheres and within the same period of time. And I would argue one being more influential than the other. Mr. Washington in his office at Tuskegee, if I was a little bit more prepared, I meant to show you the image that I'm talking about. But there's a picture of him at his desk with roses. Now this is a man that used a toothbrush to clean up at Hampton. And he walks all the way to Virginia to go to school, but he's posing with roses at a desk. He has a book and a suit. He understands image in a very clear and precise way. What made Booker T. Washington's media image so remarkable was that he created it in the midst of the nadir and the worst of America's manufacturing of stereotypes. A master of public posturing and strict disciplinarian regarding racial representation, a former student recalled this about Washington. The student said, next to a liar, he hated a dirty man or woman, worse than anything in the world. For those enrolled at Tuskegee Institute, which thrived in part due to Washington's financial arrangements with whites, the author dictated, no student is permitted to remain who does not keep and use a toothbrush. Although Americans did not begin brushing their teeth as a daily practice until the Second World War, Washington demanded that his students surpass typical hygiene expectations. He insisted on absolute cleanliness, instructed students to bathe as regularly as they take their meals, and expected them to be just as knowledgeable of table and bed etiquette as they were of math and English. He surmised that African Americans needed to present themselves as impeccably and as possible to ease the fears of whites, especially employers, as well as to exemplify respect for themselves. Many continued to incorporate his emphasis on a pristine self-image and orderly home into their own teachings. However, rather than just serving as understudies and message carriers for male educators, several black women executed their own visions for racial advancement through academic achievement and set up their own schools. Lucy Craft Laney, Mary McLeod Bethune, Charlotte Hawkins Brown, Nancy Helen Burroughs, all of these women, you know, it always takes a woman to add a little sparkle to it. So they end up crafting their own lanes, but again, they are for sure influenced by the era that Booker T. Washington really permeated. But because they worked without male supervision and at the head of their own endeavors in these freedom-based schools, their voices carried amplified tones of self-determination concerning how they would project themselves publicly and live their lives privately. Their convictions, although rooted in respectability, carried more flair than Booker T. Washington. Burroughs smirked, "I know when I look good, I feel good. I know when I come home and my house is in order, everything else seems to fall into place for me. Shouldn't we strive for that all the time?" All of this language is a part of this New Negro attitude at the turn of the century, which is largely influenced by Washington. Alain Locke, who is sort of the signature personality of the New Negro Renaissance movement, reinforced his own convictions about aesthetics by referencing Booker T. Washington and Paul Laurence Dunbar in creating new forms of beauty by instituting education and poetry that embraced the Negro's own talents and conditions of life. What did Booker T. Washington argue? He argued that you pull up yourself by your own bootstraps, and it was no need for a man from Macon County, Alabama to necessarily have a PhD in Latin when it wasn't reflective of your own circumstances. Institutional identity. Images of Tuskegee and interesting marketing plans. You can find them in any of the era's magazines and pamphlets and newspapers. It is quite well known that Booker T. Washington kept journalists on a payroll. Again, this is marketing at its finest. Washington's precise carving of his image and Tuskegee's was advantageous in the business of Black liberation. Key word, business, money making, and the ability to sustain his institution. We know that he was the founder and oversaw the management of the National Negro Business League. And so having sustainability wasn't something he just wanted for Tuskegee, but it was something that he wanted Black people by way of their economic endeavors to have throughout the United States. The mission and the main goal of the National Negro Business League was to, quote, promote the commercial and financial development of the Negro. So again, it has nothing to do with popularity or social acceptance, but rather what our pockets look like. It was recognized as composed of Negro men and women who have achieved success along business lines. It grew rapidly, with 320 chapters in 1905 and more than 600 chapters in 34 states by the time of his death in 1915. So when we talk about the influence of Washington, it is indeed national and international. The League, which predated the United States Chamber of Commerce by 12 years. Booker T. Washington believed that solutions to the problem of racial discrimination were primarily economic and that African-American entrepreneurship was vital. He himself kept contacts with members of the white corporate elite, such as Andrew Carnegie, Julius Rosenwald, president of Sears, Roebuck. He understood very clearly both corporate funding and crowdsourcing. That's a new word fundraisers use now. But Booker T. Washington was the king of crowdsourcing. Anytime you're in Macon County and you have the community donating their eggs and cows to Tuskegee, that's called crowdsurfing. The League included Negro small business owners, including doctors, farmers, and other professional craftsmen. Its goal was to allow businesses to put economic development at the forefront of getting African American equality in the United States. Business was the main concern. In 1905, the Nashville, Tennessee chapter protested segregation in the local transit with a boycott. Booker T. Washington felt that there was a need for African Americans to build an economic network and allow that to be the catalyst for change and social improvement. Also, extant press releases indicate that the League organized the National Negro Business Service to help the Negro businessmen of the country solve their merchandising and advertising problems, promoted advertising in Negro newspapers and magazines, influenced national advertisers to use Negro publications in reaching this importantly valuable group of people with this tremendous purchasing power. And if you have any access to the internet now, one of the most frequent topics that you see is Black buying power. Well, Booker T. Washington understood that 100 years ago. Wrap it up.
So we can get some time for questions.
Okay.
Yeah, thanks.
Let me see if there's anything very important I'd like to share. I'll just wrap it up by talking about the legacy of Tuskegee and how it's been able to sustain itself as an institution because of Booker T. Washington's image making and mastery of marketing. From 1912 to 1914, Madam C.J. Walker provided scholarships for 6 students at Tuskegee University. There's a reason why you see persons of her magnitude support Tuskegee as opposed to other Black institutions that existed at the time. She also made donations to the National Association of Colored People, the Young Men, the YMCA, and helped fund the effort to buy and protect the home of Frederick Douglass in Washington, which later became a National Historic Landmark. Magdalena Walker, Mary Church Terrell, Anna Julia Cooper, all their careers and personal lives even were influenced by Washington. Magdalena Walker is a great banker and financier, and Virginia Mary Church Terrell, her husband, receives his job as one of the first federal judges in Washington, D.C., in large part because of a recommendation that came from Booker T. Washington. And Julia Cooper, the great educator in Washington, D.C., loses her post in part because of having spoken ill about Booker T. Washington and his connections in D.C., and as a result, she never got her post as principal back at the N Street High School. Washington spent most of his time away from Tuskegee. In fact, the New York Tribune describes his hospitalization before he died as a nervous breakdown. But because of the marketing and his drive for image making, he took a series of educational tours across the United States to continue this mission. He recruited the very best to teach in Black America. There's a reason that George Washington Carver ends up teaching here as opposed to working for Ford, where there was $1 million offer on the table. In fact, Ford had an elevator installed in Carver's dormitory at Tuskegee so that Carver could get to his laboratory more easily in his later years. There's a reason why the Black aviators of World War II were stationed here and trained here. It is because of the reputation that Tuskegee was able to garner in large part because of the marketing foundation that Booker T. Washington laid. Many of your first founders of the United Negro College Fund, right here. Tuskegee is the only Black college with the designation as a National Historic Site. Booker T. Washington Institute is a public post-secondary school in Liberia, Africa, founded in 1929 after his death. And so, again, my argument is that not only is his image international, but it was intentional through his efforts as an image maker.